Welcome to the Cultural Revolution Module 3. In this module, we're going to cover the end of the Cultural Revolution in 1976 and its legacy up until 1989. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder of our major questions. What was the Cultural Revolution? The second question is, who was responsible for the Cultural Revolution? The third question is, what were the origins of the Cultural Revolution? And then finally, what were the long-term consequences of the Cultural Revolution for China and the rest of the world? Now for the questions specific to this module. In Module 3, you'll need to consider how did the Cultural Revolution end and why did it end when it did? Who was officially responsible for the Cultural Revolution and why? And then finally, whose vision of China won out, Mao's or his opponents? And the theme for this module is the legacy of the Cultural Revolution. By 1972, there were signs of a cooling revolution. In February of that year, we had Sino-US rapprochement, or the restoration of normal political contact between China and the United States. This was an important about-face because for much of the Cultural Revolution, and really throughout most of the People's Republic of China's history, the United States was China's chief political enemy. By having the president visit in 1972, this was a major change in Chinese foreign policy, but also in the status of the Cultural Revolution. Mao also allowed Deng Xiaoping to return to politics. Now remember, much of the Cultural Revolution had been designed to neutralize Mao's political enemies, including Liu Shaoqi and Deng. Mao may have had a lot of reasons to permit Deng's return to politics, but one of them may have been to anger his wife, Jiang Qing, who still viewed Deng Xiaoping as a political rival. Whatever Mao's reasons, by 1973, he was clearly becoming increasingly feeble. He had been diagnosed with heart failure in 1973 and also with ALS. This was starting to have an effect on his health and also on his cognitive abilities. The years between 1973 and 1976 were quieter. By 1973, many of the cadres or political leaders who helped to run the country in the years before the Cultural Revolution in 1966 had returned to government ministries. The party had also moved to control the Red Guards, the roving bands of students who often fought battles not only amongst themselves, but with workers and even the Chinese military. Many of the students who had been responsible for some of the most violent outbursts of the Cultural Revolution were now being sent to the countryside. Sending down youths meant that they were forced to leave the urban cities in which they lived and then had to go live with farmers in the countryside in order to learn from the farmers, in order to gather the farmers' revolutionary experience. Many times, these students would arrive and they would be resented by the farmers. They arrived with very few skills that were actually useful for people who lived and worked in the countryside. Ultimately, this also led to a lot of lost education opportunities. Many of these young people who would have been college-age students by 1974, 5, or 6 now lost out on those opportunities, and they became known as China's lost generation. The Cultural Revolution came to an end in 1976. 1976 was an important year for the Chinese people. Early that year, Zhou Enlai, a very important Chinese political figure, died. He was one of the most beloved political figures in all of China. In July of that same year, Tangshan suffered a massive earthquake at 3:42 a.m. In Chinese dynastic history, it's often said that the fall of a dynasty or the end of an era is precluded by a major natural disaster or calamity. Many people at the time saw the Tangshan earthquake as a sign that things were beginning to change in China. And change China did. In September of 1976, Mao died. When he died, he noted that the Cultural Revolution, the movement which he started, had quite a few opponents, and he believed that the movement was unfinished. Some of his final words were asking, what will happen to the next generation if it all fails? Meaning, if the Cultural Revolution failed. There will be a foul wind and a rain of blood. How will you cope? Heaven only knows. While much of the movement had been launched to help Mao regain his authority over China, in Mao's mind, the movement had been an effort to revive the Chinese Revolution and to lead the people into a better space. But, unfortunately, by 1976, the excesses of the Cultural Revolution had led most people in China to want nothing more but peace and stability, as they found themselves tired of Mao's Cultural Revolution. So, with Mao gone, the future of China was now more so up in the air. Mao was succeeded by an individual named Hua Guofeng, but he only ruled from 1976 until 1978. He was allegedly Mao's chosen successor, and he presented himself as a continuation of Mao's ideas, with some minor deviations. He promoted continued contact with the West and an increase in globalization. He eased a lot of the restrictions that China had over Western movies and Western literature. Hua also began the process of rehabilitating China's economy by beginning over 100 massive industrial projects. But someone still had to be held accountable for everything that had gone wrong during the Cultural Revolution. Mao was already dead, and the party couldn't blame Mao anyway. He was one of the founding fathers of the country, so breaking with him would be a rejection of the People's Republic of China itself. In order to make sense of everything that happened, the party and the country came to blame what people termed the Gang of Four. Four of Mao's closest patrons. They included Yao Wenyuan, he's the guy on the top left, and Jiang Qing, she's the lady on the top right. Now you've heard a little bit about those two. The other two who rounded out the Gang of Four was Wang Hongwen, he's on the bottom left, and Zhang Chunqiao, he's the guy on the bottom right. Ultimately, these four would be blamed for the greatest excesses of the Cultural Revolution. They were said to be appearing to be leftist, but actually rightist. And in their trial, they were accused of stealing state power and politically attacking 750,000 people, resulting in nearly 35,000 deaths. These numbers are most likely on the low end. Jiang Qing and Zhang Chunqiao were sentenced to death, later given life imprisonment. Wang Hongwen and Yao Wenyuan were sentenced to life. After the Cultural Revolution, there was a significant break with the past. Hua Guofeng had been Mao's chosen successor, but in many ways he was too close to the policies of Mao. By 1978, Deng Xiaoping had begun to rise to power. Deng was popular because, like many people during the Cultural Revolution, he suffered. And his policies were also a repudiation of Mao's radical policies. Importantly, he brought his own brand of capitalism to China, and he really pushed for what he called China's four modernizations. He had a famous line of saying, "It doesn't matter if it's a black cat or a white cat, as long as it catches mice." And what he meant by that was, even though China was a socialist country, he didn't mind using capitalist methods in order to establish the growth that he wanted. Deng pushed for development in the sectors of agriculture, industry, technology, and defense. He also set up special economic zones, most notably in the south of China, in Shenzhen, where Chinese capitalists could experiment and China could slowly transition from a fully socialized economy into one that was more tolerable of capitalist tendencies. Many of these changes were precisely what Mao had long feared, but luckily for Deng Xiaoping and China, they produced amazing economic results, launching China into what has come to be known as China's economic miracle. For much of the remainder of the 20th century, China would have the fastest growing economy in the world. But despite all of these economic changes, political changes were fewer and far between. Subsequent pro democracy movements, which were often referred to as the Fifth Modernization, failed to create change in China. What emerged from the Cultural Revolution was largely a rejection of Mao's revolutionary policies, and it also placed China on the fast track towards economic growth, powered by Deng Xiaoping's four modernizations. Politically, it also placed within China a strong emphasis on stability. Deng Xiaoping's experiences and suffering at the hands of the unruly masses of students and workers during the Cultural Revolution may have instilled in him a strong fear of large social movements. This may have contributed to his crushing of the Tiananmen Square protest in June of 1989, and it may also contribute to China's tendency today to stamp out political protest. Finally, to conclude this module, we will review our questions. How did the Cultural Revolution end, and why did it end when it did? Here you have to think back to Mao's role in the Cultural Revolution. Second, who was officially responsible for the Cultural Revolution and why? Again, you'll have to think about who, following Mao's death in 1976, was labeled responsible for the Cultural Revolution. Finally, whose vision of China won out? This final question is the most complicated. In order to answer it, you'll have to think about what competing visions for China were battling it out during the 1960s and 1970s.